Okay, we'd like to go ahead and get started for today's event on science, religion, polarization, and public trust. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Tony Mills. I'm a senior fellow here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and our distinguished panelists for what I think will be a terrific set of discussions. I wanted to begin, before introducing our panel, by making one brief announcement and just saying a few words about why we're here and what we're hoping to accomplish. So let me start with the brief announcement. I was recently informed that at around 2:20 p.m. today, there will be a test, an alarm test on your phone by the National Wireless Emergency Alert System. The unfortunate thing, besides the fact that I have no control over this, is that it will happen between 2:20 and 2:50, I'm told, and at any point during that period. So if you are able and willing to switch off your device between 2:20 and 2:50, that would allow us to have no interruption. Hopefully, if you switch your device off, or if you're responsive enough to switch it off quickly, that should also be fine. So I apologize in advance for that interruption. Unfortunately, it's going to happen right in the middle of our first panel. So apologies for that. So I would not be saying anything controversial, I think, if I observed that today in the United States we're experiencing a crisis of polarization and trust. This has been an ongoing topic of discussion for years now, particularly since 2016 and also since 2020 with the coronavirus pandemic. As evidence for the polarization crisis, we have to look no further than the recent events on Capitol Hill, which I'm sure you are all following. But there's also been an ongoing discussion about a crisis of scientific expertise now for years, and a debate about its nature and extent. This has, of course, been interrelated with, but precedes the pandemic. And we here at AEI wanted to get our hands around these problems, which are problems that we have studied for years, but by doing a new survey to really get an empirical sense for American attitudes about these topics, particularly in light of the pandemic. And so we, in partnership with Ipsos, put a survey in the field last spring and have been looking through and trying to make sense of those data ever since. And last week we published a report. I was happy to partner with the Survey Center on American Life here at AEI to do this. And we saw this as an opportunity not only to showcase some of our findings and invite engagement with them, but also to situate our empirical work into a broader set of conversations about polarization and trust. And so that's what we're hoping to do here today. We have a distinguished and diverse group of panelists. We're going to have two panels. So the first is going to focus on polarization and trust, and also religion, and will likely touch on a range of other topics. Our second panel, after a coffee break at 3, will focus more on science and medical expertise in the context of polarization and trust. And we have panelists who are coming from diverse disciplinary, national, and political backgrounds. So I'm looking forward to a substantive and interesting conversation, and one that will, I hope, bridge a divide between a lot of the scholarly literature that exists on polarization and that exists on the place of science in society, two realms that have surprisingly little interaction among scholars, but are both key to understanding the moment that we're in today. So I'm going to stop talking now and introduce our first panel. First we have Yuval Levin, my colleague here at AEI, who's the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies, as well as the founder and editor of National Affairs. He's also the author of A Time to Build, a book, the themes of which bear very much on the topic of our first panel. We also have Diana Mutz, who is the Samuel A. Stufer Professor of Political Science and Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, where she studies public opinion, political psychology, and mass political behavior. And she was also elected in 2021 to the National Academy of Sciences. And we have Kevin Vallier, a associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, where he directs the program in philosophy, politics, economics, and law. Among his many books include Trust in a Polarized Age, which appeared in 2020. And last but not least, my colleague Dan Cox, who directs the Survey Center on American Life here at AEI and is the lead author on our report. and he will be highlighting a few findings from our survey report as a way to introduce the first panel. So with that, Dan.
Thank you, Tony. So I took some liberties, introduced some data beyond our report. I'll touch on some of the findings from our report, but I wanted to bring in some other survey data to show changes over time, which I think is only possible when we have good trend data. So the first thing, Tony, I think we have the wrong slides loaded up. Bear with me. This is a preview of the next presentation. All right. Can I just start here? All right, thank you for bearing with me. So as you can see, the next panel is really going to be worth waiting for. So the first thing to note is we haven't just experienced a decline in trust in government or Congress or other institutions. We're increasingly seeing liberals and conservatives having very different attitudes and very different levels of trust and distrust of varying institutions. So this is some Gallup data that looked at a variety of different institutions from 2021. And we can see here, this is the percent of people who are not confident in these institutions. So you have, among liberals, much more likely than conservatives to say they're not confident in police, in churches and organized religion, the computer industry, which I think is Gallup's weird way of wording the tech industry. So you see large gaps there with liberals less trustful. And then when it comes to conservatives, you see they're less confident in the presidency, at least while Biden is president, science, and newspapers. You see there's some other ones along there as well. But it's really notable that the only place where you see some level of consensus and agreement is on small businesses, where there's some degree of agreement that small businesses are trustworthy. But overall, really significant gaps in the extent to which conservatives and liberals trust varying institutions. This mirrors our own survey, of course. We asked about national news media, college and university professors, religious leaders, and scientists, and the extent to which respondents were trusting of those institutions and people. And again, similar patterns emerge. Liberals are much more confident when it comes to college and university professors, scientists, a little bit less so in the national news media. And then conservatives, on the other hand, are much more confident in religious leaders to act in the public good. The notable thing here, too, we asked a question about, try to get at why this might be occurring, or what might be some underlying causes, or these correlations. And one of the things that we noted is that on the right, there's an increasing propensity to see scientists and journalists, but particularly scientists, as motivated in some of their decision-making by politics. We asked the question of whether people thought scientists were making decisions based on their personal political views. This question was widely viewed on the right as something that's true, and less so on the left. And we really saw a strong correlation. So if you thought that science was politicized, across a range of different views on a bunch of different questions, they were less confident. We actually see the same general patterns when it comes to journalists as well. The other thing that was really interesting and surprising to me, at least, was the rapidity of these changes. So when I think of the decline in trust in American society, I tend to think of this as sort of a long-going trend. It started in the 60s or 70s, depending on what you're looking at. People haven't been very positively oriented and trustful of Congress for quite some time. But when you look at something like higher education, well, we're seeing the partisan gap grow relatively recently. This is in the last 8 years. So according to Gallup, in 2015, 56% of Republicans had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education, compared to 68% of Democrats. That's only a 12-point gap. Notable, but look what happens in 2023. Only 19% Republicans said they have a lot of confidence or a great deal of confidence in higher ed, compared to 59% of Democrats. So the partisan gap in views of trust of higher ed has increased pretty significantly. And this is not an anomalous finding. We actually see similar results when we look at other polls and looking at other institutions. So when it comes to national media, for instance, the Pew Research Center found that in 2016, 70% of Republicans had at least some confidence in national news media. That was cut in half over the next 7 or so years. Now only 35% of Republicans have at least some confidence in the national news media. So again, really similar timing when it comes to this growing political gap in trust. This stands in pretty stark contrast, too, to what's happening with organized religion. So liberals are and have been less religious than conservatives for a good long while. Rates of disaffiliation are much higher on the left than the right, even though we're seeing an overall decline in American religiosity, pretty much however you measure it. This is a pattern that stretches over decades and not over just the last few years. So this is looking at the percent of liberal Americans who are not confident in churches and organized religion. So in 1993, a little less than 6 in 10 said they were not confident. That rose to about 80% in 2021. But if you go back even farther, I think GSS data allows you to do this. You see that it's pretty linear and straight trend. So year over year, you're seeing a little bit less confidence in organized religion. The other thing that's notable is that, believe it or not, most liberals do identify as religious, and the perceptions of secular and religious liberals are actually quite similar when it comes to this decline. So secular liberals and religious liberals report similar levels of mistrust or distrust in organized religion. So this looks at the composition, the political composition of people who attend weekly. And so it's not just we're seeing a decline in confidence, but the folks who are showing up week in and week out in the pews in religious services are quite different today than they were back in the late 90s. If we could go back even further, I think it would even, the trend would even be more sort of equal. So in the late 90s, roughly close to 6 in 10 church attenders, regular church attenders, were Republican. Around 4 in 10 were Democratic. Fast forward to 2022, and it's now about 3/4 of regular church attenders are now Republican, and only 20 or so percent are Democrat. I should note that this is among white Americans where we see the most significant political divides. Black Americans, of course, are highly religious, and they tend overwhelmingly to be Democratic. So we see these patterns most starkly among white Americans. And so, well, what does that mean in terms of people's everyday experiences? Well, there's some indication that this could have or lead to social segregation, so that if I'm regularly attending a congregation, most of the members are conservative, that's a social context that has rapidly changed in the US. At one time, at least when it comes to class and politics, participation in religious services was important, served as important bridging capital in the US. Even if a lot of these congregations were racially and ethnically divided, they remained places where you would come across people with different political beliefs and different class backgrounds. But that's far less true today. And it's not just the result of liberals leaving at disproportionate rates. There's new evidence and there are new surveys suggesting that conservatives are actually looking for politics. And there's a recent paper out that says that church shopping is increasingly common among Protestants who are less concerned with denominational identity and more concerned that they find a religious space that they feel politically comfortable at. And I think that's another part of this. So for this data, what we're looking at is conservatives who attend services more than once a week, and the political composition of their friendship groups is dramatically different from conservatives who are less religiously engaged. The last thing I'll note before turning it over to our panel to provide some introductory remarks is the way media structures some of this as well. So for over a decade in my polling career, I've been asking questions about media trust. So what different media outlets do you most trust for news about politics and current events? And we looked at differences, particularly among Republicans who trust Fox News versus other media outlets. And there was what a lot of folks in the polling community identified as the Fox News effect, where Republicans who most trust Fox News had different ideological profiles, they had different issue priorities than those that trusted other media outlets. In this poll, we asked about not only Fox News, but we asked about whether folks trusted OAN, Newsmax, Breitbart, and other more conservative media. And so we grouped these responses in these groups accordingly, and we found that actually the Fox News Republicans are not that different from Republicans who trust other media, so NBC, ABC, local news, social media. And it's actually the Republicans who trust OAN and Newsmax and Breitbart who really stand out on a lot of these questions, whether their confidence in media, or the federal government, or even getting vaccinated, right? So we see really significant differences there. I already went on longer than I wanted. I want to turn over to our panel. I have a bunch of questions I would love to ask them, but we'll start with Kevin to offer about 5 minutes or so of introductory remarks, maybe dealing with the data or something entirely different.
Thanks for having me out. There's a lot of really distinguished people in the room, and also the panelists are far more distinguished than I am, so I'm really honored to be here and to be with all of you. I'm a philosopher by training, and I've worked in 2 areas relevant to the survey results. The first is I've worked a great deal on religion and politics, and written on some empirical, but a lot of political and normative issues there. And I've also, my book, Trust in a Polarized Age, and some other work I've done, I've spent a lot of time with trust data and trying to sort of understand the basis of trust and the way that institutions work in order to increase or produce trust. I've been interested lately, in particular the last couple of years, in political polarization. Actually learned a great deal from Diana about this. But it's my sort of next area that I really want to focus in. So that's just a little bit of background about me. So I guess I want to ask you some questions about the data. One of the questions that I had was whether, in particular, some of the religion data was broken down racially.
Yes. So it's pretty conventional. So I began my career at the Pew Research Center, and it's pretty conventional or traditional when you're looking at like Protestant denominations to break it by religion. White evangelical Protestants look very, very different from Black evangelical Protestants on a whole host of issues and political behaviors. So that's pretty typical.
And did you also find that they had pretty different attitudes as far as organized religion or what they're looking for in a church and so on? Because, I mean, I think of a lot of polarization as sort of more focused on white parts of the population.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it becomes enormously more complicated once you introduce racial and ethnic diversity into the picture. And one of the reasons why that chart was filtered on white Americans, because the pattern is extremely clear and becomes much more muddled once you include Democrats who are Black and Hispanic and Asian Pacific Islander.
Yeah, I mean, the reason it matters is because a lot of the coalitions on the Democratic Party that are racial are quite religious. And I gather, at least and be corrected, is that it's white progressives that are significantly less religious. And I think it produces pretty different patterns that I think bring out, in some important ways, the ways in which, say, religion facilitates certain issues. So, for instance, this bonding, bridging question applies to religious groups, right? So there are some churches and denominations where they really just talk to each other. But there are others that, say, are in inner cities and they run soup kitchens and they're in direct contact with people. And I've often wondered and would love to see broken down more and to read more on this about the extent to which bridging churches, rather than bonding churches, are able to overcome some of the distrust and polarization differences, in part because they're interacting with groups of people that are less like them. Because at least one of the things I'm very interested in is I think there's a lot about the formation of trust attitudes that we don't understand, particularly at the sort of psychological or individual level. I think it has something to do with social norms, and I'm actually visiting at Penn with a team to look at some of that. But one of the common sort of thoughts about trust is that it's contact with others positive contact with others that can build it. So at least that was a sort of one question that I had going through, were the patterns of interaction with difference and the extent to which that would sort of mollify distrust or polarization. So, you know, the results are interesting. I'm not in a position to challenge any of them, but I do think the amount of food for thought there, particularly I think on the connection between religiosity and trust and polarization. That's why I asked about the religion breakdown, because I think it's pretty different than what one often hears in the media, right? We hear, oh, everyone's polarized, and they're polarized around ideology, but that isn't actually always the case for a lot of the different groups that we think of. So.
Wonderful. Diana?
Sure. I'll keep this short, although I have lots of additional things I'd like to talk about now that we've gotten started. My background is in studying American politics and trends in public opinion in particular. And as I read the report, I have to say I wasn't all that surprised to see that the COVID era exacerbated lack of trust in science and scientists. And I say that because what was really front and center throughout COVID was how the sausage is made. And we all know that's never pleasant, right? Going through thinking, oh, do masks matter? Do they not matter? Oh, do we have a vaccine? Do we not have one? How many things will it cover? What percentage of, all of a sudden, this was in our daily, environment and part of our discussions. And I think a huge amount of scientific progress has traditionally taken place behind closed doors, slowly, with lots of mistakes, lots of setbacks. So to have that all kind of out in the open and be so critically important during this era really did kind of make it clear what a very difficult process science is, and scientific progress in particular. At the same time, the sheer speed with which a vaccine was developed, I think, should give many people a great deal of confidence and desire to support science in the United States, because obviously it's just tremendously important. With respect to trust and polarization, I'm one of these people who kind of gets tired of hearing everything being blamed on polarization without necessarily being clear about what they mean. And so one of the things I'd like us to do in this discussion is be a little clearer on what do we mean. In political science, we talk about polarization among the mass public, that is just Democrats disliking Republicans and vice versa, but we also talk about their policy opinions, and those have not polarized nearly as much. But then we also talk about, well, if the public is getting these attitudes or taking cues from political elites about don't trust science, it's no wonder that we have a bigger gap based on partisanship. So I think if we're going to try to be constructive here, we need to get to some of the root causes, both of our exaggerated perceptions of polarization in this country, because we know that they are, we perceive a lot more than is actually there, but also, what to do about it. And one of the things I'll note is that I've written a lot about what I call hearing the other side, and that is, where do people come into contact with those who are politically different from them? And in particular, what kinds of contexts promote more positive interactions in that setting? And it's overwhelmingly one answer, that is, it's the workplace. Most people do not have much control over the people with whom they work. And as a result, over 50% of Americans say their workplace is evenly mixed with Republicans and Democrats. However, and when you ask them about people they talk to about politics, overwhelmingly, if it's someone different politically from them, it's somebody they know through work. So the workplace is a really important context democratically, even though it's not a highly protected context for political discussion. We spend a lot of time there, and as a result, these kinds of things come up. We also make friendships there. We develop respect for others in the workplace because we're generally working towards some sort of common goal. Unfortunately, what my latest study shows is that, of course, everybody's staying home now. And as a result, we asked people about, do they work from home now most of the time, half the time, or all of the time? And that has taken a big bite out of their exposure to political difference because they are not inhabiting a diverse environment where they need to get along with other people on a day-to-day basis. So I'll add one other thing that I think is worth thinking about. This is obviously a very rich survey, lots of data about all kinds of different topics. I think in looking for relationships between things, it's really easy to jump to conclusions about what causes what. And yet, resolving that issue of what is causing lack of trust, polarization, and so forth is really a very difficult enterprise that requires a lot of careful thinking as well as data. And so in looking at the decline in trust in science, trust in government, all kinds of trust, I think it's important for us to take a step back and try to think about root causes rather than just start finger pointing at media and academics and politicians and so forth. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I appreciate this extraordinary survey, Dan, and really all the work of the Research Center. We're very proud of it here at AI. And just being on stage with these two, I've learned, if there's anything I'm going to say that I didn't learn from one of you, it's probably wrong. So thank you. I guess what I would add to this conversation so far is a way of thinking about trust that comes for me from the work I've done over the years about institutions. Because I think what you're asking a lot of people are really a set of questions about trust in institutions. What does it mean to say we trust scientists or journalists? That has to do with trust in a profession. And I think that can actually clarify a little bit about what we mean by social trust in general, because when you think about trust through the lens of institutions and professions, one thing I've come to see is that there are kind of two axes by which we might approach the question of trust. Trust involves confidence in competence on the one hand and restraint on the other. When you trust somebody, maybe you think they are capable of doing what they say they're capable of doing, they're up to it. Maybe you think they will not abuse their power, they won't do things they shouldn't do. Those are both really essential elements of trust, and obviously they're intermixed, they're combined. But I think in thinking about the contemporary crisis of trust, it's actually really worth our while to distinguish them, to separate them. Obviously, some degree of the loss of trust we've seen in 21st century America has to do with the competence question. There are all kinds of reasons for thinking that certain kinds of American elites or professionals are incompetent in some important respects. You can talk about the Iraq War, if we can do that in this building, or the financial crisis. Maybe people would talk about COVID too, and say we have reasons to think that professionals aren't as good at what they're supposed to be doing as they claim. But I think a much greater portion of the loss of trust that we've seen in the 21st century has to do with the loss of the sense that people are restrained in their use of power. It's a trust that, for me, when I think about polarization, it has less to do with left and right and more to do with up and down. What we're seeing is a loss of trust among the broad public in the country's elites. And the view is not these people don't know what they're doing, though people say that too. But above all, these people are unrestrained. They will do whatever they want. They're not restrained by professional and institutional commitments. What does it mean to say that you trust a journalist? I think what it means is that you think this person is constrained by a set of procedures. Similarly, when you trust a scientist, what you're saying is, when this person speaks, I think that he or she is speaking out of a process, and that what they say is the result of a process of verification. If it doesn't seem like people are actually answering to those constraints, or actually being a journalist or a scientist before they speak, we're just less inclined to trust them. And I think a lot of that loss of trust has had to do with a kind of mission creep in a lot of American institutions, where people in positions of authority or prominence take it upon themselves to play a part in the political theater of 21st century America. It's very hard to avoid. And that makes it hard for people to trust them as professionals. when they go out of their way to say that they, whatever it is, that they love Donald Trump, it's a little harder to take them seriously as a minister, or that they hate Donald Trump and then they're your doctor and you want to say, well, are you really? Why did we start the conversation like that? I think a lot of us in one way or another have found ourselves in that situation in the last 2 decades or so. And it does make it harder to trust professionals when it seems as though they're using a platform available to them by way of the capital of the institution they're part of to advance a set of interests that are not connected to that institution. That sense that people are unrestrained, that they're using their position as a platform for something else, I think is a peculiar kind of loss of trust, peculiar to our contemporary circumstances. The idea that people are incompetent, that's not news. The idea that people are corrupt, there have always been corrupt people. People in power have always, in one way or another, run the risk of abusing their power. But I think that this peculiar sense that people are unrestrained, and particularly unrestrained by institutional obligations, by professional responsibility, it's not entirely novel to the 21st century, obviously, but I think that it is an unusually large part of what the decline of trust in our time has been, and that's reflected in the kind of loss of trust we're seeing. It's why when we ask questions about institutional categories, which is what we're doing when we say, do you trust doctors, do you trust teachers, do you trust bankers, the results you're getting are polarized in a particular way. People who don't trust elites don't trust any elites. And I think we see that in an incredibly broad, you can explain why people don't trust one kind of elite with some particular reason, right? You might not trust, I don't know, public health professionals because of your view of what happened in COVID. You might not trust politicians after some scandal. But Americans have lost trust in everybody at the same time. And I think that has more to do with the sense that elites in general in various parts of American life have become less restrained and constrained by what are really the sources of our trust in them. And in that sense, it's not simply a left-right problem. It's more connected to the peculiar character of contemporary populism, which is now more of a right phenomenon than a left one, but certainly not entirely so. And I think it forces us, when we think about how to build trust, to see the significance, the importance of demonstrated restraint, which is very, very hard to show, of approaching people over whom you want to exercise some authority with humility, which I do think scientists traditionally tend to be pretty good at. They sort of make a virtue of their own humility. They'll tell you what they don't know, and they're proud of it. But that is a very, very hard kind of virtue to develop and sustain. And I think that's what rebuilding trust would involve in a lot of these categories.
Thank you all for those comments. And I want to dive right into one of, for me, the sort of elephant in the room, which is like the pandemic, right? Diana, you alluded to the fact that fewer Americans are spending time in the office, right? That's, I think, a direct result of the pandemic and policies in response to it. There's a number of examples of antisocial behavior that it's increasing, that people seem to be withdrawing from public spaces more, even after vaccines are available and trusted, at least among some of the public. There's now a new report from the Washington Post showing that homeschooling is going through the roof. And there's a huge decline in trust in public schools, particularly on the right. So my question to all of you is what is sort of the long-term prognosis of interpersonal institutional trust in a post-pandemic world? And will we get back to where we were before, or are we headed in a completely different direction now?
I can't predict the future. I won't pretend to. These disruptions to our lives, staying home and working from home, or having your kids at home and schooling them from home, it's obviously easier for people to segue into that kind of thing when they're already doing it due to COVID. Obviously, they don't need to anymore, but you can see why this lingers. And you can also see why employers in an era when unemployment is very, very low don't want to come down hard on their employees and say, no, you really got to show up. So it's a difficult time. I don't think that will necessarily last forever. I do think that employers have in many cases responded, attempting to make work a more attractive place to be. I know I miss my colleagues, and I'm happy to be around them, but there aren't as many people around anymore. One thing I will, if I can interject here, you suggested that everybody's losing trust at the same time in all these different institutions, and yet when I saw your slide, it looked to me like, well, it's kind of one direction or another for each institution, but it's not everybody, the same political party that's low on one versus the other. In fact, it's sort of like people have segregated by institutions that they trust. And I find that interesting. I mean, they're all big gaps regardless, but it does seem like people are capable of trusting some institutions while distrusting others.
Yeah. I would also say if you look at the trust data overall, and Gallup has this since the early 70s, there is decline in just about everything except the military and local government. When you break it down by party, the decline accelerates more, is more extreme for some institutions than others. But broadly speaking, stepping back from that data, maybe you disagree with this too, Dan, but it seems to me that saying everybody's lost trust in everything is more or less where we are.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to split the difference here. So I think there are some important institutions where we do see that polarization, and I mentioned some of that's recent, but I think Gallup asked like 16 or 17 institutions, and for a lot of them, Republicans and Democrats were not that far apart if you look at the sort of bottom half of that chart, or the bottom 3/4 of it. So I do think there are some important exceptions, but they probably are more exceptions, important ones like organized religion and police.
Yeah.
But I think that's where I come down in terms of what the data shows.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with the decline, but it's just different groups of people
Yeah.
Who are declining for different institutions. Mm-hmm. But that's, I think, part of your point, which is the politicization of everything,
right.
which is taking place. And I find it really sad, but also interesting that not just universities, but businesses are all, putting out political statements regularly. And personally, I don't like my professional organizations or my universities voicing views for me. I prefer to be able to do that myself. And of course, mostly we're not consulted when that kind of thing is done either. And I do think once you politicize everything, it's a lot easier to decide who you like, who you hate based on similarity. It means everything is identified very readily politically. Mm-hmm. Even, I was going to say, during COVID, one of the things that happened is we all became so aware of what was going on scientifically because we were all waiting, for something to make life easier. Think about how many people would even know who Tony Fauci was in the past. Nobody in the US could have identified the person in that position. And yet there were multiple animals, I'll say, one dog and one chicken in my neighborhood named Tony Fauci during this period. Everybody knows who these people are. And normally we don't know scientists' names. We don't know the Surgeon General's names.
So I want to just add to the panel's sense that we need to make more distinctions between what we're talking about. I mean, for two reasons, just to get a grip on what we think, but also to draw any kind of causal inference. One thing I've learned from Diana is just what she said about how many different axes along we can distinguish between things. Is it affect? Is it issue by which we're polarized? Is it elites versus the masses? Are we sorting, that is, into different groups? The conservatives become Republicans, or actually changing our minds? And right, that's 8 different possibilities for sort of combined concepts. And of course, in the work on the conceptualizing polarization literature, which I find extremely interesting, there's even more ways of looking at it. Which statistical concept best describes polarization? What, in a two-party system, it might be easier to model than in a multi-party system. So there's a whole host of questions. And what it's, for me, the kind of holy grail of what we're looking at in potential dysfunction in the United States is if there's some kind of connection between various kinds of trust and various kinds of polarization. I think a lot of people that I talk to think that there must be some connection. And it seems very intuitive, but actually, and Diana can correct me if I'm wrong, the stuff on, at least on social trust, and affective polarization, just on those two specific things, because it could be political trust, right? It could be elite issue polarization, but this would be just, I've seen 2 studies in the last year, one in Spain, one in the US, suggesting that affective polarization can reduce social trust. That's about all I've seen. And so there's very, very little out there that I think helps us to figure out how these phenomena are connected, and that everybody thinks that they are. Now, trust in institutions is in a way easier to explain, at least on my view, because political trust, I think, tends to be a function of what I call inputs and outputs. So inputs are the process, right? Are they proceeding in a way that's fair or non-corrupt or restrained? And then are they actually doing their job, right? Are they competent? And people's views about that will change, and trust in institutions can change a lot. It can change even between elections. Social trust, though, is a lot less clear of a concept. It requires a lot more care. It does not behave in the same way that political trust behaves. It changes much more slowly. It's usually very stable within particular countries. The US between the 60s and the 90s saw this big drop. Of the established democracies, that is, democracies that have been democracies over 50 years, that's really weird. It's not as weird for countries that become democracies later. Political trust looks like something we kind of track and judge responsiveness. Social trust is very strange because we never meet most people. Right.
So I want to jump in here a bit.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one more bit. But I think one thing that's common between different concepts of polarization and trust is attitude, and the attitudes that we think others bear us. So particularly in the philosophical literature on trust, it's to trust someone is thought to be to rely on them, and then some other thing, some kind of moral attitude that they bear you think they bear you goodwill, or that you think they'll be fair, or that they think they'll be benevolent. People don't really agree on the precise thought, but one of the things I think is going on with distrust isn't just a matter of whether people are restrained, but whether people bear you fundamental goodwill. Do they even like you? And so, I mean, again, this is very, very speculative, but it might be the case that one connection between polarization and trust is people's sense of their attitudes towards one another, and whether, again, they bear them goodwill or bad will. So, one thought would be, when everyone's cooperating in World War II, you get a huge upsurge in trust, lower polarization, because people think, oh, look, everyone did their part, everyone worked together, people had good attitudes. And I think part of what we're seeing is that the World War II generation was maybe really anomalous, and for all we know, we could just be returning to form to some degree.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit, the sort of generational patterns of trust. Pew not too long ago released this really depressing and fascinating report showing that young people across the board, whether it was institutional trust, interpersonal trust, were just really, really low. There was like 30 and 40 point differences between young adults, age 18 to 29, and seniors. And my question is, to what extent this is an age phenomenon versus a cohort phenomenon? Will this group be forever untrusting due to social media, due to the fact that they participated less often in various civic organizations, they're participating less often in like scouting and youth sports compared to previous generations? I am also very concerned about like social media. How is that impacting social trust and interpersonal trust? Or is it just that young people are always somewhat mistrustful, and as they grow up, they join a workplace, they perhaps get married and settle down in a community, that trust sort of naturally accrues out of those life experiences?
Well, I guess it depends a little on how you're defining social trust. The way that social scientists most often define it is not in terms of the people in your community that you know. It's really about, if you were to pick random people out of the middle of the country, could you trust them? So it's about trust in strangers more than trust in your community and so forth. So I guess in that sense, I'm not sure. I think what's going on, and that I have had wonderful dissertations done on the relationship between rising affective polarization and the decline in social trust. And there's definitely a strong relationship there. But the idea that participating in voluntary organizations is going to help that's where I have serious doubts, in part because voluntary organizations tend to be really homogeneous. The organizations that aren't are involuntary organizations like work or the military or other kinds of venues where people are brought together. Sociologists have found that even things like gardening and choir clubs increasingly weed out the people who are dissimilar from the core of people who are already there, and they go join a different gardening club. So because they're voluntary and there is this sort of human desire to seek out similar others and to like similar others, it's hard for voluntary organizations to perform that function because we have so much choice. And given choice, people choose like-mindedness.
I think one other factor to think about here, Dan, is that a lot of our social science on this begins in the middle of the 20th century. And that was a very odd time on all of these, in all of these dynamics. There was a very unusually high level of trust in institutions in the middle of the 20th century. Surely not something you would have seen in 19th century America. I think if you asked Americans in the 1880s what they thought about Congress, they would have said they didn't trust it at about the level that we do now, if not more so. And when you asked Americans what they thought about Congress in 1968, they had a lot of trust in Congress. Really, you look at those numbers now and you think, what's going on there? I think it's worth our seeing that there was something anomalous about that period, not only because it means that all of our numbers look like declines, but also because that's when the generation that we now think of as older Americans was formed and grew up and built its attitudes. But the question you asked is a very hard question. I'm inclined to think that social media tends to undermine this kind of trust just because of my own experience of it, but that's not a very good way to answer the question. I would say that in that limited experience, what I find, I'll tell you this, I'm not on Twitter and that stuff, but I spend a little time on Facebook, and by virtue of who I happen to be, that I'm an immigrant who's Jewish with a PhD, I know a lot of people on the left. I work at a place like this, I know a lot of people on the right. And those two worlds on Facebook are completely different planets. They spend all their time talking about each other, but in ways that the other side would not recognize. Everybody today on the right is mad about something that nobody today on the left has even heard about, and vice versa. And so I do think that there's a way that this kind of self-selected group, where you think you're learning something about other people in America, but in fact it's worse than learning nothing about other people, couldn't help but undermine social trust.
There it is.
Well, they can't say you didn't warn them.
I got about 10 minutes.
To be thought through.
Yeah. In our studies, what we find is people's networks, their personal networks, are most homogeneous of all, which makes sense. Yeah. We spend time with people similar to us, like-minded, et cetera. Social media is more diverse than that. So it at least brings some of the loose ties in, as Facebook seems to be doing in your case as well. But the real change has been in the extent to which both television and newspapers expose people to views different from their own. I wasn't so surprised to see this for television because it's the rise of partisan TV networks, but I was really surprised when we asked people what kind of newspapers they read. I didn't think we would see a huge effect there. But really, now that they have choice, they don't have to just go with their local daily. They choose online newspapers to read that are very like-minded too. So it's not as bad as what they do on television, but it's also a huge shift.
Yeah, so two brief thoughts here. One is that, for a long time, we don't really know, I think, how social trust is learned and transmitted. The longest time people said, oh, people who join associations, they have high trust, it must be the association driving the trust. Well, most, I think now, political scientists agree, maybe overwhelmingly, that it's high trusters that are high joiners. So people are joining institutions because they are already trusting. So that was supposed to be like one of the easy ones, right? That was supposed to be like, oh, for sure that helps. And I've worked with two economists on this. They're Scandinavian, and of course there's a huge amount of funding from their governments and things because they want to know why they're able to trust so well. And they just keep finding for every interesting correlation between social trust and X, that when they do the relevant causal analysis, they find that social trust is in the driver's seat, or it's correlation's spurious or there's some third cause. Like just in terms of finding out in any sustained way, look, here's what we know about what causes social trust. For a while, I thought observing corruption in institutions. But now a Norwegian economist is telling me, well, it might be trust to corruption. There's low social trust, there's more corruption. So this is one reason, just to amplify Diana's point about how important it is to distinguish between different concepts and so on, in part because we have to be very clear about what the causal hypotheses are. So I've just become gradually over the last 10 years less and less confident that we know how to do anything about social trust. I know that's a bit of a downer, but I want to say something about what we know, and I just don't think we know as much as we thought.
Well, often, I think, for example, the whole affective polarization, for those who aren't familiar with that people measure that by asking you how you feel about one party and how you feel about the other party and looking at the gap between the two, and that gap has grown tremendously. Initially, I think what was sent out to the public as a message about that is that we all hate one another. Well, no wonder we're afraid to get together with people that like us if we think we all hate one another. The truth of the matter is, it turns out when people answer those questions, what they are really answering about are political elites. And political elites are much more extreme than the public. And people who are instead interpreting that as being about the person of a different party next door are incorrect. It's really what we see out there via media for the most part, and that people are responding quite strongly to, and we have, as a result, the largest number of independents I think we've had since we've been polling. So there are a lot of people refusing party labels, and that seems to go at odds with this idea that it's such a polarized environment that we're in.
So I want to return, Dan, to your opening comments when we talked about the importance of workplaces. And if we're seeing increasing education polarization, right? So college-educated folks and particularly those with more advanced degrees, are increasingly on the left or more democratic, and those without are more on the right or more conservative. Does that mean that we should expect diminishing utility from the workplace as a place for people to be exposed to differing political points of view and perspectives?
I don't think so. I mean, it's flipped. Yes, it used to be Republicans were the more highly educated political party members. But the way workplaces are organized these days, it isn't the secretarial pool and all people with the same kind of training work together. That's no longer how most workplaces are organized. And so people do tend to know people of differing political views from work, if they go to work. And they also meet them as clients, customers, and so forth.
And the other thing I wanted to throw on the mix here too is there was a really interesting Atlantic piece written during the pandemic about the destruction of weak social ties. So the people that we kind of know, that we may see in the same place, whether it's at the gym or a workplace colleague that we, in a different department, that we bump into in the elevator regularly. And the argument was that basically the pandemic destroyed these relationships. And how critical, I mean, there's been some research that shows that when it comes to getting a new job, that weak social ties are incredibly important. In fact, more important than your sort of immediate social circle, because it's putting you in different social worlds. But I don't know that we know much about the sort of construction of weak social networks, or B, how that impacts broader social trust. Anyone want to sort of jump in?
I recently replicated a study I did back in 1996, and I did it exactly the same way I did it in 96, which wasn't easy because a lot of things have changed. But there's been a huge decline in the extent to which people are exposed to cross-cutting views in general in all their networks, but especially through work. And I think part of the problem is people are suspicious of one another more so now than they were in the past. Our perceptions of polarization are really, really high. So even though we might well be able to have a conversation with someone who's quite different from us politically, we don't go there because we're afraid to. And I think we've also lost some skills. I'm speaking entirely for myself, but I think the social skills to navigate diverse environments are something that you develop from practice, and the ability to work together with people that you don't necessarily agree with on much. We're out of practice. And it would, I think, behoove us all to get better at that.
One thing that, oh, sorry.
Good.
One thing that's interesting about social trust when I talk to audience about it is I say, we socially trust most people to what? Like with political trust, we know we're sort of trusting them to do their job, right? Like that they're at the Environmental Protection Agency, why then they ought to protect the environment. But one of the curious things about social trust is we don't really even entirely agree what we're placing trust in. One thought that I've been working on with another professor at Penn, Christina Bicchieri, is thinking about social trust in terms of social norms. These are kind of public practices where they're lines of conduct we expect people to engage in, but we also think they ought to engage in. These include all kinds of things of helping out someone who has trouble on the street, of not using insults in conversations. There's a whole range or panoply of social norms, hundreds in operation at any one time, and we kind of have a sense for what they are, and we have ways psychologically of learning norms. Now, there's not been a lot on norms and trust, but here's at least an interesting study that got me very interested. It was in the Netherlands. If you looked at people that were especially COVID vulnerable, it looks like it, and maybe it's gone now, but a temporary drop in social trust when they perceived or others not wearing masks. And so the thought here was that, oh, look, trust has declined a little bit. Oh, weird, we got social trust to move. And it was because they thought, at least this is my hypothesis, is that they thought there were norms in place, that is, people were expected to wear masks, and everyone thought they ought to be doing it. And yet they saw other people they didn't know, right, that weren't wearing them. And so there was a violation of the social norm. People didn't do the thing that we all really know we ought to be doing. And that may have caused social trust to move a little bit. So at least my view is that we need to probe more in terms of research of the relationship between social norms and social trust. And that may give us a better sense about how it's learned and transmitted. There are different theories, but I actually think that's going to hopefully turn out. And we have a survey out now of 6,000 people in the United States, 2,000 above poverty line, 4,000 below, where we're going to test some of those connections. So yeah, I just think a huge amount of the action in trust is figuring out how social trust is learned and transmitted, and even getting clear on what we're socially trusting people to do.
Wonderful. Well, I've been selfishly asking all the questions. Does our audience want to ask some questions? A few. I think I saw it back here, right here. Oh, I pointed back here, Price.
My name is Roger Cochetti. I'm an editorial contributor to the Hill newspaper, and I am old enough to have observed the evolution of polarization in the United States, and I wanted to put forward a proposition and get some reaction to it, because it is evolved quite significantly. If we think back to the time when this country was most polarized during the Vietnam War, fundamentally, what each side thought of the other was the other side is stupid and I'm smart. They're dumb, I'm smart. Lyndon Johnson accused Barry Goldwater of being stupid and he was smart. Richard Nixon accused George McGovern of being naive and he was experienced and smart. So somehow, a few years ago, one of my siblings explained to me that they were cutting off one of our cousins from social media because they couldn't stand to hear, they had completely opposite political views and they're both quite active in it, and couldn't stand it because the other person was presumably evil. So what has happened, and then even in a scientific discussion I went to, one of the scientists couldn't avoid accusing the other of being evil. So what seems to have happened is that we have shifted from an environment in which somebody who has exactly opposite views from yours is stupid, but still respectable, but stupid, to the point that if somebody is evil, you don't respect them. You don't respect the evil person who's on the other side. So, by the way, the only other thing I say is I try to think back over this long period. What is the first time I saw a public debate where the person on the other side was evil, not stupid, but evil. And it was Richard Nixon's impeachment. In the 1970s, the argument against Richard Nixon was not so much that he's stupid or something like that. Spiro Agnew was stupid, but Richard Nixon was evil. So that's the point at which morality started to enter into this, and it's just grown over time. So that's my proposition. I don't know how that fits into what any of you had to say, but I'd be interested to get reactions of the historic trend in all of this. Thank you.
Everybody's looking at me. I have studied the incivility of political discourse over time, and it is, far more uncivil now, at least public discourse. And what I mean by that is the stuff that all of us see in the news, on television, and so forth. It's not the case necessarily that politicians way back when were very civil with each other. But we get to hear all of this stuff now, and because of the competition for our eyeballs and news audiences, it pays media organizations to ramp up incivility in their programming because we can't look away. I mean, it's a lot like rubbernecking on a highway. It's not that we like to see people get hurt or dead bodies by the side of the road. We don't. We're decent human beings. But we're kind of hardwired to pay attention to intense conflict. And by ramping up incivility, programs enhance their ratings and get larger audiences. But it also normalizes that kind of discourse. And there are some studies that show that that has now seeped into the mass public as well. Certainly it has on social media, where people don't feel a need to act respectful towards someone who's stupid or different from themselves.
Bryce, person over there.
Hello, my name is Willie Chirpman. So curious, my understanding is that there's a pretty consistent delta favoring local politicians. So if you ask people, do you like your local governor versus governors in general, or your congressman versus congresspeople in general, people tend to think more highly of their local official. What is like the best leading theory to explain that?
Well, it actually goes in stair steps. That is, people are most trusting of local government leaders, and then the further out you get to state, to national, et cetera, the less trust they have. One theory, I can't tell you if it's right or not, I haven't done any direct studies myself of this, but one theory is that we don't really have a clue what local government does. And I have to say that for myself, that's definitely true. There's the county, the township, there's so many different levels of government. It's very hard for people to know who's responsible for what and who to blame for what. There's far less visibility as well with the decline of local newspapers. There's less accountability for local governments just because people aren't all that aware of what they're doing and what they're not doing that we think they ought to be doing. So yeah, it's not a complete answer because that pattern goes way back to even before local newspapers declined, but I do think it's another thing where we're seeing more about national politicians. My colleague has written a book called The Increasingly United States, in the sense of we are all now geared toward national politics in the same way, and we see a lot more about that than we do about local politics.
Hi, my name is Nicole Krause. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Science Communication Department. I have a couple of questions. I actually have a lot, but I'm going to just ask a couple that are related to interpreting the trends data that you presented. One question I had was, how high should trust in institutions go in various institutions? I guess in part because the poll data presented provides some kind of description of declines, inclines, but there must be some kind of bounds for like a floor and a ceiling at which things become dysfunctional, like that some level of high trust is dysfunctional. So I guess curious what your thoughts are about that. Another question related, I guess, is earlier in this conversation we've mentioned, well, a couple of times that there's been some movement where we have more independence, for example. There's some kind of sorting of partisan allegiances, people moving in and out. And I just wonder how that affects how you would interpret the trends over time, where a Democrat in 1993 is not the same as a Democrat in 2023. So what does that mean? And then the last question I had was about trust as a risk, so acceptance of a risk. So if you have subgroups of the population who are exhibiting lower trust in medical professionals, for example, I guess to me it seems like given that different groups take on different risks in trusting someone, consider a black woman in a maternity ward, for example, versus a white man at a hospital, is a vote of confidence of a particular measure on this scale from a black woman, their trust in medical professionals, comparable to that same level of vote of confidence from a different subgroup, given that they are accepting different risks potentially by trusting these people. I have many other.
Yuval, for the first one, I might nominate you. When you write about this a little bit, that like, I forget when, like maybe in the 50s, you argue that maybe our trust was a little bit too high.
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible to have too much trust. And, you know, if you think about the sort of self-understanding of American culture in the post-World War II period, some of what's going on there, to us it seems like a sort of strange crisis of confidence for a society with enormous confidence in its elites. I think it felt to a lot of people like a kind of coerced conformity. And when you look at the culture of the late 50s, early 60s, it is a culture screaming for relief from conformity. And you know, there's a way of understanding some of the crises of the 1960s as disillusionment that is only possible as a result of illusionment. And so, yes, excessive trust you might call illusionment, right? A sense that the elites can do no wrong, so when they're just human beings, you become cynical. I certainly think that's a risk. It's, you know, I would say from our vantage point now, it's a problem that I wish we had, but it is a problem, and there is a kind of pendulum when it comes to confidence in institutions in that way, because I think we feel with great force the particular kind of loss of trust or of frustration that we have at given times, so that era of the middle of the 20th century launched a kind of liberalization, economic and cultural and social, that I think in a lot of ways was very good. We now feel like we're paying the price for all those things, and we've come to see that liberalization. We've come to see the downside of it in any case. So yeah, I think there certainly can be a ceiling as well as a floor that we should watch out for.
I mean, it's generally thought when you look at trust literature across different disciplines, philosophy, political science, and so on, that in economics, that you want to apportion trust to trustworthiness, right? So if it gets to below actual trustworthiness with respect to some task or rule, or if it gets too high, there's disadvantages either way. Now, of course, you know, it's generally better for there to be more trustworthiness, so you want high trustworthiness, and then you get high trust, and like, oh, that's great, they go together. But yeah, if they vary too much with respect to each other, then there could be pretty serious problems. Trust becomes irrational, even if it might have good effects. And so then what do you tell people to do? Well, do you try to deceive yourself so that you'll be more trusting? No, yeah. Too many of the discussions are, let's raise trust. At least what I've found, you know, we need certain practices, or liberal rights practices, as I call them, that move trust by moving trustworthiness in institutions.
Maybe we should call it a crisis of trustworthiness.
That's exactly what I was
absolutely.
going to say.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think for me as a professor, one of the saddest things that I have seen during the course of my career, and I actually started at UW-Madison as an assistant professor, back then when you taught political science courses, there were students who thought about running for office and becoming leaders. Nowadays, I don't hear that at all from my undergrads. They want to distance themselves from political elites, and they don't want to be part of that. And, you know, it's very sad, because those are the kinds of people we would love to have running for office, and yet they see politics as too tainted a business to get involved in.
Back corner.
Yeah, hi. Arthur Demrich. I'm the director of the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes here in DC. So in the history of science, we, of course, have seen the rise of an institutional response to low trust, and actually an intentional development of low trust environments. So an organized skepticism, creation of peer review, creation of ever more kind of numerical quantitative research as a way to say, I don't trust that person's laboratory findings until we can verify and prove it. So it strikes me this conversation is about, well, there's a good benefit to social trust in that it's kind of a low transaction cost environment. It's much easier to carry on business or do things with people who you trust. If we're entering a low trust environment, what are the analogs to what we successfully developed in science that we can apply in domains outside of it? So in other words, how do we move forward from here? What are the institutional mechanisms we put in place that allow us to function in a low trust environment? What's the equivalent of peer review for politics?
You know, I think the key to that kind of process where you really transform skepticism into confidence is trust in process and not in people. And I think that when you think about institutions or when you think about professions that have successfully built up public trust. There's a story like this about American journalism, too, where the professionalization of journalism in the 19th century, beginning from a very, very low place, where there was no reason to trust anything in the newspaper at the end of the 18th century in America, and getting to a place where there was some reason to trust much of what was in the newspaper, involved a kind of development of procedures that were transparent and distinct from persons. Some of that has been lost in journalism. Much of it has been for all kinds of reasons we can talk about, economic and cultural. I do think that the strength of both public confidence in science and internal confidence within the scientific community is a function of adherence to that kind of process and of explicitly working to take pride in humility, to say, I don't know, and by that to mean you should take me seriously. That's a very, very hard thing to do. That's an extraordinary social achievement to get to a place where you've built a culture where acknowledging your ignorance is a show of strength. I think that one lesson from the experience of science on that front is that it does take institutions. It does take trusted procedures that stand apart from persons and from interests. It's obviously very hard to do outside of that kind of professional context. But I do think there's some lesson there in how to get from low trust to high trust.
Let me the last question right here.
I'm Mona Charon. Thanks for a really interesting, stimulating conversation. So I would like to hear all of you on this question, because at the same time that we have seen this marked decline in trust that is reflected in polling, there are certain real-world things that have happened in the last 10 or 15 years that suggest the exact opposite. And I'm referring here to the rise of businesses like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, which require a tremendous amount of trust in strangers, where in the case of Uber and Lyft, you're really putting your life in the hands of someone you don't know. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how that fits into the larger picture of loss of trust.
I mean, there are complaints about a lot of the ways that trust is measured and with respect to surveys. In particular, the generalized trust question, which I think we know, can you trust most people? Can you never be too careful in dealing with people? And there's a lot of critiques about how good that measure is. And one of the counterexamples is, we're doing some pretty socially trusting things now. And people have found, for instance, that among marginalized groups, that can you never be too careful can cue feelings of distrust. And so now some people like the OECD will say, well, ask people, can most people be trusted? But don't ask that other bit. So the OECD report on measuring social trust. So there's a lot of questions about, the survey data itself, and this is what people will sometimes say is, well, it's just hard to get a sense for maybe our polling isn't entirely accurate. And I have some thoughts that I won't go into about how to do it better, but I just think that's a good point.
Yeah. I think it's a very important question, Mona, and there's I think we have to see that we begin in a free society from a baseline of tremendously high general trust. When Amazon tried to operate in China for the first time, they ran into a problem that people were not willing to pay and only weeks later get something in the mail? How do I know it's going to come? And the alternative to Amazon, when Alibaba started, they created escrow accounts where they held the money. And when you got the thing, they paid the sender. We just trust that it'll come, right? We send money in all kinds of ways all the time. And as you say, some of these new technologies too, where, you know, I don't know anything about this driver, but I'll get in the car and it'll be fine. That's kind of a crazy thing to do. And I do think that it suggests that for all that we worry about trust rightly, we do begin from a baseline of assuming that, you know, the random stranger is probably not going to hurt me. And that's not a small thing.
Yeah, I mean, as a country, we are so much higher on social trust than other countries are. We sometimes forget that. It's not that bad here relative to many other places. I did have a thought, though, not specifically on Uber and Airbnb and these kinds of things, but these alternative kinds of things. I was thinking, you know, they start with younger folks. I think my kids had stayed in Airbnbs before I did the first time. All of them had. But we have a study going on right now where we're looking at who invests in crypto. And one of the fascinating things about it, it's not who you'd expect. Some things are who you'd expect. They're disproportionately male and young, but they are really low on trust in government, and they're primarily disproportionately minorities. And that they're people who are like anti-institutions, don't trust the standard institutions, like going to a Marriott for your hotel, but are willing to go to Airbnb, which is really interesting because I would not have predicted our findings on crypto. And we're tracking those people to see what happened after SBF's thing and all that too.
I'll end it on this. And one of the things that you mentioned is something that actually I've written about with a piece looking at youthful distrust. And noting that, yeah, there's all these survey questions showing that there's, you know, really, really low institutional trust, interpersonal trust among young people, but they use Amazon reviews, they use Rotten Tomatoes reviews, right, to make decisions about what to watch. They use reviews on Airbnb. So in one way, you know, these are strangers, but they're vetted at least in some way. Or you may have had a friend or family member who used the same, right, Airbnb or Amazon product. So it's not exactly the same thing, but it is an interesting phenomenon where you sort of see relying on aggregate trust, right? So I'm relying on the opinions of many, many people to make these important personal decisions for myself. Thank you. Please join me in giving a hand to our panelists.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our second panel here in just a minute. Please take your seats. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. For those of you just joining us, thank you for joining. I'm Tony Mills. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute and co-author of our new report on science, religion, trust, and polarization. Before introducing our distinguished panel for our second discussion this afternoon, I want to begin by just saying a few things about our survey and situating some of its findings in the context of the present discussion. So we heard before, for those of you who were here or watching, some of the findings from our survey report, and we had a discussion about a number of the themes that were raised. And what I want to do is focus in on a few different aspects of the survey report that I think will tie into this afternoon's discussion on science. Okay. Can you hear me if I'm not talking out of this? Okay. Oops. So I want to begin by situating the empirical research we did in two ways. One is in the context of the literature that we have, the social science literature we have on trust in science. And by the way, I'm using science fairly generically to include things like medical science. It's not the most elegant way of talking, but it's useful for present purposes. So, and then also situating this research in the context of history. And we heard a little bit about that in the previous panel, and I think there'll be some interesting parallels and points of tension between those, perhaps. So we have been measuring trust in science going back to the 70s, and actually before that. We do have some empirical measures going back to the 50s, but they really sort of become more robust and diverse starting in the 1970s. And as we heard on the previous panel, there are a number of methodological, empirical, and other questions that can be raised about trust, the distinction between trust and trustworthiness, trust and confidence, the ways we can or cannot measure it. But I want to bracket those for now. One of the advantages of having asked a lot of questions about trust for so long is that whatever limitations our survey data may have, we can discern some broad patterns. And one pattern is that trust in science has actually been historically quite high in the United States. And this is something that's well known to experts, but is sometimes a surprise to those who are not part of this scholarly discourse. There's a lot of discussion and has been for years, sometimes periodically, lots of discussion in the 1970s, for example, about a crisis in science, a crisis of expertise. And yet, if you look at survey data at least, Americans in particular express relatively high levels of trust in science compared to other countries, compared to their trust in other institutions. Particularly compared to these other institutions here. So this is a Pew Research Center graph based on their data. So I'm going to do something in these first few slides that is sort of abhorrent to quantitative social scientists, which is to move between different kinds of data sets fairly easily. I'm just trying to paint a general picture. So we can see here that scientists are trusted based on these measures more than just about anybody listed aside from the military. And I think everyone in this room probably knows that public trust in government in particular has declined quite a bit over time. So that's a very pertinent comparison point. So Americans' trust in science has remained relatively high. It's also remained relatively stable, at least since the 1970s. And once again, that's compared to trust in other institutions, which has declined. Of course, not across the board. There are lots of important caveats that can be made. But just at a very high level, we see a decline in trust in lots of social institutions, but a fairly steady amount of public confidence in science. So here's another Pew graph that shows that. Obviously, things go up and down, but a fair amount of consistency over time in broad outlines. Compare this to average confidence in major US institutions. This is from Gallup, I believe, looking at organized religion, the military, Supreme Court, banks, public schools, newspapers, Congress, etc. So prior to, say, 2019, the question that lots of social scientists asked was, what's going on with science? Why are Americans actually so trusting of it, particularly when there are often perceptions that there's something wrong, a kind of crisis of science? And there are different theories and accounts of that. What we found in our report is that, in fact, trust in science is now going down. It's going down not universally among Americans, but in a fairly widespread way. And this is since 2019. And this is according to several different measures that we looked at. So here's a graph showing that. So from 2016 to 2023, here we have, as I mentioned, science and medicine are often used jointly. I'm going to focus primarily on science. But we can see a general pattern here of a decline. And I'm going to go into some more detail about this in a minute. I just want to, last historical context setting is to suggest that we might be, and this was also suggested, I think, in the previous panel, we might be entering a period of time that has some historical analogs. The 1970s, for example, when prior to this relative stability of high trust, we saw declines. Again, empirical measures are not perfect if we go back before the 1970s, but we can still get a picture. So there was some work done in the early 1980s that showed, for example, from 1957 to 58, the number of Americans that said that all things considered, would you say the world is better off or worse because of science? The number of Americans who said better was 83%, and that number went down to 71 in 1976. And there was a debate among social scientists during this time about whether or not this supported the then prevailing narrative of a crisis in science and expertise. If we think back to that period in history, lots of things happened, lots of things that we might think of as naturally generating distrust in institutions. I think some of our, again, not the same data sets, but many of our findings are even starker than these declines, which should give us some sense of where we are now. So the decline that we have seen since 2019 has been steepest among Republicans. This probably doesn't come as a surprise. The polarization of trust in science preceded the pandemic, but it seems to have gotten worse. So overall, 86% of Americans expressed a great deal or some confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public in 2019. That overall number went down to 69 in spring of 2023, so that's a 17 percentage point drop. That's all Americans. Among Republicans, it went from 82 to 56 during that same period. And among Democrats, it also declined, but from 91 to 82. And this graph is just showing those numbers. But it's not only Republicans that have lost confidence in science, contrary to a prevailing narrative that might suggest that. Trust has also declined among some racial and ethnic minorities. So these are the overall numbers here at the top. So this is the same survey question we asked. White, non-Hispanic Americans, 87 to 71, which is tracking fairly closely with the overall. Black, non-Hispanic Americans, the decline was 85% to 69, and among Hispanic Americans, 82 to 61%. Okay. Trust is also low today among certain religious groups, particularly white evangelical Protestants. So overall, we have 69% for all Americans, and then this is broken down by different religious group. And as you can see, white evangelical Protestants are actually an outlier among religious groups for the levels of trust that they express in scientists to act in the best interest of the public at 52. And then we could compare them to the most trusting group, which is the religiously unaffiliated. We find that they're actually kind of mirrors of each other when it comes to trusting science and trusting religion. Okay. Americans with lower levels of formal education, regardless of party ID, you can also see enormous gaps. This, to my mind, is one of the most interesting findings in our survey. It's not that surprising, perhaps, but I think it's quite significant in its political and social implications. So the percentage of Americans expressing a great deal or some confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public, those who have a bachelor's degree or more, 84%, said a great deal or some. Those with a high school degree or less, 56%. Among Democrats, we can actually see a similar trend. So today, Democrats with a bachelor's degree or more of education, 94% of them express some or a great deal of confidence, compared to 65 for Democrats with a high school degree or less. Among Republicans, we see a similar spread. Interestingly, it's not quite as dramatic. And the other thing I want to note is that the number of Democrats with a high school degree or less is surprisingly similar and lower than Republicans with a bachelor's degree or more. And if we think about some of the demographic shifts that have been happening within the parties in the past few years, migration of non-college educated Americans out of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, that might give us some suggestions for thinking about what's going on here, or some of the implications of it, at any rate. Okay. I want to just by way of closing, focus on one issue that received a lot of attention in our survey, has become a very important issue in our public life, and I think we're going to talk a lot about in our panel, which is vaccines. So we looked at a number of different things, but vaccines was one issue in particular that we focused on, and we found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that vaccine attitudes and vaccination status have become highly polarized, and they have along very similar axes to what we've seen before. So by party identification, 89% of Democrats self-reported being fully vaccinated for COVID-19, 74% of independents, and only 58% of Republicans. Pretty stark between Democrats and Republicans. College-educated Americans are more likely to have been vaccinated as well. So I'm going to just move through this fairly quickly in the interest of time, but you can get the picture. Americans fully vaccinated for COVID-19 by religion. Here the picture is a little bit more complicated, and this is something that we might be able to discuss. White evangelical Protestants are, again, an outlier. The other religious groups are interesting, and I don't really have a theory for what's going on there, but I just wanted to share that. It's particularly interesting when we note that certain ethnic and racial minorities have historically expressed higher levels of hesitancy or distrust in vaccines. And based on our data, doesn't necessarily seem to have translated into the vaccination status of those groups during COVID. Okay, so we also looked at whether trust in science might be correlated in some way with general institutional distrust, and we did that by asking self-reported measures of trust in a range of institutions. And we found that there is indeed a very tight correlation there, that 51% of those in the lowest quartile are fully vaccinated for COVID-19, and 89% of those in the highest who report confidence in government, media, academia, religion, and science are fully vaccinated. So this, to me, may suggest a broader explanation, or at least point in the direction of one, where though historically science has been a bit of an outlier, the institutional trust and trust in science in the United States are now coming into some kind of dynamic interaction with all sorts of social and political implications. So I will stop there, and then I want to introduce our panel so we can hear from them and less from me. So joining us today, we have Maya Goldenberg, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. And she's also the author of the excellent book, Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science, which came out in 2021, an unbelievably well-timed book. And I hope we can talk about that a little bit today. We also have joining us Roger Pilkey Jr., who's a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he teaches and writes on a diverse range of policy and governance issues relating to science, technology, and energy. He's also the author of the book, The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science, Policy, and Politics, among many others. And he writes a newsletter by that name, which I recommend to all of you. Last but not least, we have Kimberly Michelle Rios, who is a professor of psychology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And she is also an editor of multiple academic publications, including the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion. And as of January 2024, if I have this right, will be editor-in-chief of the journal Self and Identity. Her research looks at religion and science, among many other things. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Maya, and feel free to sit or stand as you prefer.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing me here today, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'll start by maybe explaining what does a philosopher do around vaccine hesitancy, because I'm not doing the empirical research. So what philosophers do in general is we analyze arguments, concepts, often the values that underlie the language and ideas that we have. So I use those skills as a philosopher of science to investigate the arguments explaining the causes and sources of vaccine hesitancy. And when I started this research, it was the case that the dominant narrative was that it is a problem of science illiteracy. If only people understood the science, then they would think the same way that experts do about vaccines. Now, I should say this is before COVID, when the primary concern around vaccine hesitancy was pediatric vaccines. Looking at the empirical evidence, the survey data, for this case for science illiteracy being the problem, I could see that the argument did not hold up. There wasn't a strong connection between vaccine hesitators and their level of scientific education. And what was also interesting about that wasn't just that the argument was wrong, but that it's such a persistent argument. It is a comfortable narrative to say about why some people don't do the things that they should be doing, a way to explain why people don't listen to experts anymore, which was seen as a troubling problem. Now we use the language of misinformation. So this is just to say that that narrative is still there, despite a lot of evidence saying that it's not a problem of information or misinformation. So as a philosopher, I said, let's try to unpack the arguments and see if there's a better way to frame it. And I reframed the problem as what I called in my work a war on science. I said, here are the reasons that that doesn't fit. Instead, I think it is a crisis of trust that we're encountering here. And that's really the conclusion I drew. So this was pre-COVID work, but I'd say surveys like the one produced by the AEI confirm this, that the best predictor of whether someone wants to get vaccinated is if they trust the system that brings them the vaccine. So if you don't trust the system, you're not going to trust the vaccine. That makes sense for a number of reasons. One is vaccines are not just grounded in science. They're grounded in a huge governing and regulatory body that needs to keep it safe and get it into the arms of people in an equitable way. Also, what most of us know about, most of the scientific decisions that we make, or science-based decisions that we make, is based on, not on reading the literature ourselves and coming to informed conclusions. Not that we don't do that, but probably the biggest the way that we come to make these kinds of decisions about complex scientific issues is grounded in epistemic trust. That is a concept that comes out of philosophy. You'll also find it in the psychology research. We rely on experts to help us navigate complex information. So the question is which experts you go to for information, not whether we listen to experts at all. So I actually deny the claim that no one listens to experts anymore. We're just rethinking who counts as a legitimate expert. And that has to do, of course, with the expert's epistemic trustworthiness, whether we trust scientists in general as knowledgeable scientists, but also commentary about their moral character. Do we think scientists are actually working in the public's interests, and more specifically, whether they are working in the interests of someone like me? Okay, I will stop there because I think that's a good lead on for you.
We're going to skip over Roger and come back. Kimberly.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor to be here. So as Tony mentioned, I'm an experimental social psychologist. I do mostly surveys and lab research on a variety of social identities and social groups to which people might belong. And I have a specific interest, which is most relevant to what we're talking about today here, in religious identity. And a lot of my work in the past decade or so has examined how different religious and non-religious groups stereotype and perceive each other, and what kinds of consequences that has for religious and non-religious people. So one specific example is perceptions of this inherent conflict between religion and science as two schools of thought that cannot, do not, should not go together. And how does this perception of conflict, independent of whether a conflict actually exists, how does that affect religious people's willingness to engage with and trust scientific experts and scientific institutions? Just as a little bit of background on how I came into this topic in the first place, in December 2011, I took a vacation to Morocco, and it's a part of the world that I had never been before. And in talking with some of the people that I met there, the subject of the religion and science relationship came up. And particularly, I said something like, yeah, in the US, there's this perception that religion and science are in conflict, that they don't go together. And I just said that matter-of-factly because it's a narrative that I grew up with and I took for granted. And my Moroccan friends were shocked at this. They said, well, really? We've never thought of that as a phenomenon. And I was, in turn, surprised at their level of shock. And it really led me to think that this notion of a religion and science conflict might be, above all else, socially constructed. And again, this is regardless of whether a conflict actually does exist or not. And one of the survey results that really struck me was about the perception of religion and science conflict and how that differs between groups. So in the survey results, it indicated that post-2020, perceptions of a religion and science conflict have widened. And this is especially the case among Republicans and especially the case among Americans with a high school education or less. But it struck me when reviewing these survey results that there's an important nuance here. And I think there's a lesson to be learned in not necessarily treating Republicans as the same as those with a high school education or less as the same as Christians. And what I was struck by is that in a lot of my own research and the research of Elaine Eklund, who's a prominent sociologist of religion, has shown that the people, when you look at religious affiliation or religiosity, the people that tend to see science and religion as being most in conflict are not the religious people, but it's the non-religious people. So that really, to me, underscores the possibility that it's not, that the idea that science and religion can't go together isn't some property inherent in most religious people's fundamental personal beliefs or religious values, but again, it's a social construction, and it is a byproduct of the way that we tend to form caricatures of the other side. So we have non-religious people tending to think that religious people fundamentally don't trust, aren't engaged in, and are not competent at science. And we have religious people making a lot of assumptions about non-religious people's agenda as well. And so I'm not claiming here that religious people never see a conflict between religion and science. And in fact, there probably are cases where maybe somebody interprets the Bible word for word and really thinks the earth is just over 2,000 years old and doesn't believe in any sort of science. Sure, those cases exist, but they're very likely more rare than the average person would assume. And I think that, as I'll talk about hopefully a little bit later on, these perceptions of religion and science as being in conflict have very deep and far-reaching consequences for religious people's ultimate trust in and participation in science. Thanks.
Roger.
Right. First, it's great to be here. It's great to be on the panel with Kim and Maya. Maya's book is excellent. It's titled Vaccine Hesitancy, but it's really one of the best books on science and technology policy of the last decade, so pick it up and read it. For me, the most interesting statistic to come out of the report was the fact that Republicans with a college degree and Democrats with a college degree are more similar in their confidence in science than are Democrats with a college degree and Democrats with a high school degree, which tells me partisanship is not obviously the only thing going on here. And this leads me to a hypothesis, and it's not one that's new. Dan Sarowitz articulated it more than a decade ago when he said that to the extent that the scientific community sees itself as an arm of the Democratic Party, it's going to cause problems for scientists down the line. And we can go back in history and take a look at how science has presented itself to the public and to policymakers. And the concept from the last panel, trustworthiness, is essential. I mean, we all know you can't separate science and politics, but you can make scientific advice to the public and to policymakers more or less trustworthy. We can go back to the 1990s, the Gingrich Revolution, and soon after, the termination of the Office of Technology Assessment. And whatever the merits of that termination, afterwards, Jack Gibbons, who was the head of OTA, was appointed science advisor to Bill Clinton. And the Republicans said, aha, I knew it. They were always partisan. That was just a foreshadowing what was to come. In 2004, for the first time, I think ever, a group of dozens of Nobel Prize winners signed a letter supporting John Kerry's presidency. When Barack Obama came into office, he famously said, I'm going to restore science to its proper place. That sent a signal that many scientists, particularly, and when I talk about scientists, I'm referring mainly to PhD scientists in academia and government. Many scientists said, aha, we're going to be in charge now. Green light for politicizing science. If you look at Science magazine, the late Donald Kennedy, who was the editor, wrote more than 60 lead editorials criticizing the Bush administration, showing a level of involvement in politics that really we hadn't seen favoring one party prior to that. 2017, the March on Science. There's an empirical study that surveyed participants, something like 99% Democrats marching to 1% Republicans. All of this is to say, whatever macro factors that we've heard about behind declining trust in institutions, we experts, we scientists have poured gasoline on that fire by becoming much more partisan. And part of that is we have eaten away at institutional legitimacy. So I've led a project for the last few years looking at science advice around the world in COVID. And one of the things we've documented, and it's not just in United States phenomenon, is something we call shadow science advice. It's the rise of scientists who organize to create non-governmental, unofficial organizations to challenge government science advice. So famously in the United Kingdom, there's the SAGE, which is a great acronym, and a group of scientists formed what's called the Independent SAGE to challenge them. And there was massive confusion amongst the public, even amongst members of parliament, with differing advice. And it became very politicized, and the public said, you know what, they can't even get their own story straight. In the United States, under Donald Trump, there was the Coronavirus Task Force, which was populated by all political appointees, except one, Anthony Fauci, who later became a political appointee for Joe Biden. And so it's very easy, since 2019, to see that we experts have willingly participated in the politicization of science with the idea, and it's this old deficit model idea, that if only the public got the right information, believe me, not her. And so this, I think, helps to explain this educational gap. Is it possible that the people who most trust science just happen to be highly educated, white, secular, wealthy, mostly males, just like the center of gravity of the scientific community? Or is it that Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, high school educated Americans, religious Americans, they're all just dumb? So I think what has happened is that we have replaced affinity and like-mindedness for trust in science. And the antidote, and we could talk more about this, is we need to go back to building strong institutions that are trustworthy. And for us, it's really uncomfortable in my community, and I can talk about my own experiences. It's really hard in academia these days to invite diverse views from across science, whether it's COVID or climate change, pick your topic, because we think, you know, we're this close to the levers of power. If only we can just, you know, get rid of the Democrats or get rid of the Republicans. And so the politicization has taken root within the scientific community.
So there's a lot that I want to ask all of you about. Thank you for your remarks. I wanted to start with you, Maya. It's interesting and striking that your work on vaccine hesitancy predates COVID-19. I wondered if you could say a little bit about what the state of that literature and the politics of vaccine hesitancy was like prior to COVID, and then how it has changed. And so just by one data point that I noticed from your book, in 2019, the WHO listed vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 global health threats. That was 2019 before the pandemic. So that would suggest that this was already a fairly high-profile problem. But the political situation surrounding it is not obviously the same. So anyway, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. The politics of vaccines and vaccine hesitancy has changed so much in the only 8 years that I've studied it that I think it actually deserves some comment. I came ready. I want to read a quote from a Politico article that was published in February 2015. This is around when I started. And this is a quote from an American professor of government affairs. And he said this: "Vaccines aren't a partisan issue. The consensus in favor of vaccines in this country is very strong and extends across every religious and political group. There is no reason it should be otherwise. Communicable diseases don't care what party you support." And I actually think that captured it correctly in 2015. There was vaccine hesitancy. It was a great concern. There was a ton of social science research on it, and philosophers like me started getting interested, but it was actually not clearly an issue of the left or an issue of the right. It hit a little more to the left, actually, among affluent, urban mothers, left-leaning mothers. However, there were other pockets on the right, and it was explained that there were different cultural reasons that people had hesitancy and also affinity towards vaccines. The explanations usually go toward ideological views and not, as I'd mentioned earlier, scientific literacy. So we had people on the right that had sort of libertarian views, didn't want to be vaccinated. We had people on the left who were concerned about toxins and wanted a more natural lifestyle and were fearful of vaccines for that. In addition to that, also a lot of concerns about weak regulatory systems and this idea that healthcare and government were in the pockets of big pharma. Okay, so that's changed since then. So this was what I just described was 2015. There was a movement in the years before COVID of the language of vaccine resistance to change. I think organizers saw that they weren't getting a lot of traction among politicians with their claims that vaccines caused autism, vaccines were not safe, because no serious politician was going to stand behind those kind of arguments. So the language shifted to the question about freedom. So medical freedom became the issue, and shouldn't parents have a right to decide about vaccines? And that got a lot of traction for a couple of reasons. First, certainly Republican politicians couldn't shy away from that argument. It was something that they was felt the need to back up, especially this was sort of tail end of the Tea Party. It was also a way to evade the social media algorithms that were keeping false claims about vaccine safety and efficacy from being posted. So it became a question of freedom, and that really picked up more so during COVID. So now we get into COVID, and it started leaning much more to the anti-vaccine sentiments, or I actually try not to use that word. Vaccine skeptical attitudes lean more towards the right. The issue of freedom became even more strong during COVID because vaccine mandates entered with such force. In fact, all the sort of early work to persuade the publics to get vaccines were sort of stopped because it probably was moving too slowly for the perceived risk, and vaccine mandates and vaccine passports came in. And this was exactly what the sort of freedom argument needed to really solidify that kind of argument. Meanwhile, on the left, the response from, let's say, public health officials, politicians who were supportive of vaccines, such as the Liberal Party in Canada, the Biden administration here, was to say, but science. So they were countering freedom arguments with science arguments, and the two don't fit. They are saying different things. It also puts the left in an uncomfortable spot where suddenly liberals don't care about freedom. That is not the kind of political space you want to be in. So that's 8 years of political discourse.
So I should say, for any of these questions, any of you should feel free to jump in. And I'm wondering if Roger might have something to say on this issue in particular, given your argument about the role of partisanship or perceptions of partisanship in eroding trust?
Yeah, one thing we do traditionally very well in the United States and in Europe is science advisory mechanisms. Vaccine approval committees. People generally have no idea that they even exist. Notable in the United States compared to many countries around the world, and this is under Trump and under Biden, if I say to you, where is the high-level expert advisory committee located to answer scientific questions related to the pandemic? There's not an answer to that question. Early on in the pandemic, OSTP, Office of Science Technology Policy, Health and Human Services, it asked the National Academy of Sciences to put together such a high-level committee, and they responded positively. And they got, I think it was 25 people. Unless you're a health expert, you wouldn't know any of them. It's exactly the sort of thing the National Academy of Sciences does very well. They functioned for about 8 to 10 weeks, and they did some rapid reports that they produced. When conflict has come up over things like masks, are they effective or not? Reasonable people will certainly disagree. The scientific community does a lot of studies. We don't have an anchoring body in the United States to start that discussion. So in climate change, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Are they infallible? No, but they're a starting point. And so one of the things I think that we see is as the politics developed, it became science versus these other arguments. And in the United States, the voice of science became a person, became Tony Fauci. And we also know that science advisory mechanisms do not work well when they become identified with a personality. That's not how it works. In Europe, they appointed a chief scientific advisor, Ann Glover, and she got into some hot water over some comments she said about the politics of GMOs in Europe. And so the European Commission said, all right, we're getting rid of the science advisor and putting in a science advisory mechanism, which was viewed as being much more legitimate, out of the limelight, and it didn't have a single personality. So I think there are some institutional lessons here to take that if we wanted to have a firmer bedrock, and again, it's not going to prevent or stop politicization, but it does give us a stronger institutional base for people to trust authoritative bodies to provide information on questions like masking and vaccination.
I want to switch gears for a minute here and ask Kimberly you a question, which your comments provoked, but I'm also curious to know what Roger, you and Maya might have to say about this. So both you, Maya, and Roger alluded to this sort of received model, sometimes called the deficit model, where the problem of anti-scientific attitudes or skeptical attitudes is a lack of information, a deficit of information or knowledge, and the problems with that kind of approach. I want to actually get more into that a little bit later. But in your remarks, Kimberly, you also talked about the conflict thesis, the idea that, or the perception that science and religion are in conflict. And I kind of want to put these two things into some sort of dialogue, the deficit model and the conflict thesis, because one of the striking things about the idea of a conflict between science and religion is that most experts don't perceive such a conflict. That is, experts who work on the history of science and religion generally reject that. If there is a consensus view in the history there, it's that there is not a conflict. Obviously, people's viewpoints differ among philosophers and theologians, but among the people that study that issue, you don't really see much conflict. You also indicated that among religious people, you tend to see less perception of conflict. So on the one hand, it sort of seems like an issue where there's a deficit, right? That if people were aware of the fact that experts who study this didn't see a conflict, maybe they'd be less likely to see a conflict themselves. I'm not sure that's true. I'm just posing this as a question. How do we understand the perception of a conflict, particularly in light of the disparity between what a lot of experts say on that subject, and why might religious people not perceive one?
Yeah, so can I ask the question in response to your question? So in the survey where you found that the conflict perception between religion and science has increased since 2019, how exactly was that question worded?
That is a good, I'll have to double check. I don't have it on hand. But I want to add something that is relevant here, which I do remember. which is that generic question showed increased conflict. But if you break it down by different areas, things get a little bit more complicated. So we had evidence, for example, that there is less disagreement over evolution among Americans today than there was several years ago. And we actually found that by a number of different questions, including some trended questions we asked. And so it's well known that answers to that question among Americans varies a lot with the wording of the question. And in particular, if the question allows for a kind of theistic view of evolution, that is, it's not a question that precludes there being some kind of harmony between evolution and religion, a lot more people are accepting of evolution as a scientific theory. But anyway, we did find that that seems to be less of a point of conflict, and yet we also found, based on other questions, that there is increased perception of conflict.
Okay, well, I'll tell you a little bit more about why I asked that question. I found myself thinking as you were asking your initial question that there are many different ways to think about the conflict between science and religion, and I think you're right that, I know you're right, that a lot of historians of science don't perceive an inherent conflict in terms of science and religion as ways of knowing about the world. But then I think where my research comes in, and that of a couple other scholars, is when you start thinking about whether people believe it's possible to be a scientist and hold a strong religious identity. And that's where I think you see a lot of conflict perceptions. And I would argue, and have shown in my research, has some real consequences for religious people, particularly Christians' representation in science. So just to give you some general statistics, ever since the early 20th century, the percentage of Americans who report believing in God or being religious has been disproportionately higher than the percentage of scientists who report believing in God or having a religious affiliation. And the percentages range, so right now, depending on how the question's asked, between 80 to 90% of Americans believe in a God or a higher power. But again, depending on what year the survey was conducted, which scientists you're examining, if it's scientists at research institutions more broadly or members of the National Academy of Sciences, the percentage of scientists who report believing in God or a higher power ranges somewhere between 7% and 25%. So that's a pretty astounding discrepancy. And even though Christians are still a majority group in the US population, I argue that their underrepresentation in scientific fields is a big problem. And in fact, so for those of you who don't know, my field, social psychology, is pretty secular and, well, like a lot of academia, I guess. And I've gotten a lot of pushback when trying to publish research related to these topics, and comments from reviewers along the lines of, well, why should we care about whether Christians are represented well in science? Don't they inherently not trust science or have worldviews that are incompatible with science? And I'm thinking it's comments like these that tend to maybe push people out. Taking the perspective of a Christian for a moment, why would I want to engage in, why would I trust an institution or a set of experts who thinks that I don't belong, that it's not possible to hold a cherished identity of mine and ascribe to scientific ways of thinking or identify as a scientist? So in some of the surveys and experiments that I've done, I've actually found that reminding Christians of the notion that other people think there's a conflict between religion and science, or reminding them that science tends to be mostly secular and scientists are mostly non-religious, or simply reminding them that their group is negatively perceived in science in terms of being less scientifically competent than non-religious people, that makes Christians perform worse on tasks that they think measure their scientific ability. It makes them less interested in pursuing or engaging with science. And I would argue that in this era of decreased trust in science and increased perception of science as a social identity that's really important to people and tied to other social identities. That this polarization and the consequences of this religion and science conflict perception for religious people themselves and their engagement with science is likely to get even worse over time without some sort of intervention and without religious people really seeing that, yes, science and religion are perceived as compatible. This is a welcoming place for people with my social identity. There are people like me who are perhaps openly religious who happen to be scientists.
Yeah.
I wanted to add something. I'd also like to hear what you have to say about this. In the science and in the science studies scholarship, especially work around public resistance to scientific claims, there's been a pretty good argument that people's scientific attitudes, let's say whether you think vaccines are safe or those or climate change is real, is often a proxy for the political issues that they are concerned about. And that's largely because we do a lot of arguing about science. So whether the general public really knows that COVID, the spike protein in the COVID vaccine is going to pierce your organs, probably most of us don't know that. However, people glom onto these arguments because there might be the down the road policy that they're concerned about. So I couldn't help wondering if the fact that you're seeing more convergence among people on the left and the right thinking that evolution is a good explanation for our lives, maybe has something to do with the fact that we are some years away from the latest dust-up about whether intelligent design should be taught in schools and whether science education and religious education are fundamentally opposed to each other. I mean, the suggestion is it's the practical consequences that people care about. If you want to be a scientist and be religious, I don't see anyone stopping you from doing that. You may not feel welcome, I agree with that, but it's a life that could be lived.
Yeah, it could, although I'll pull a little bit from research on, say, underrepresentation of women in STEM disciplines. Not feeling welcomed and not feeling included is a very, very strong predictor of ultimate engagement and participation of in those fields. So, for example, one of my colleagues, Chris Scheidel from West Virginia University, has done a series of studies on religious graduate students in the sciences and finds that, yes, it's a life that could be lived, you're absolutely right, but religious students in science tend to conceal their religious identities. They don't feel comfortable openly talking about these identities or their identity as religious to their peers or to their professors. And in fact, when I give research presentations about my work on Christians' underrepresentation in science, I'll inevitably have somebody come up to me afterward and say, "Oh, thank you for doing this research. I'm religious, but nobody in my department knows it because I don't feel at ease disclosing that." So yeah, I think it depends on what outcome you're examining, for sure.
This is actually closely connected to a question I wanted to ask the group. So there's lots of literature and discussion around the underrepresentation of different groups within science or STEM fields, women, different minority groups. And in certain pockets, at least, of the scientific and social science literature, we have studied tools that might be effective at trying to mitigate that or correct that, particularly on the issue of vaccines. Your work being an example of that, where shifting from an information model to a trust model might be more effective. And I wonder, actually, if some of the data we found on the high level of vaccine status among certain racial and ethnic groups in the US during COVID might be an indication of the success of some of those tools. So that's maybe another question we could come back to. But the question I want to ask now is one way to look at what's happened with the polarization around trust in science, especially since, but not beginning with COVID, that groups like Christians, particularly white evangelical Protestants, conservatives, are moving into a space that historically we've associated more with, say, minority groups, women, with respect to STEM fields? And if so, do we have lessons that we can learn from efforts to deal with those disparities when thinking about religious people, for example? And could this partly explain the sort of strange dynamics that we've seen around the politics of this? Because white evangelical Protestants may not be the most well-liked group among a lot of the people that populate scientific and medical institutions. Generalizing, but I think probably a fair one. Anyway, so I'm curious to hear from any of you on that.
I mean, I'll talk about it in the context of science advisory mechanisms. Over time, we've seen really a lot of progress in science advice in trying to diversify those individuals who provide advice. But that diversity is limited. So there has been a push for more ethnic diversity, more racial diversity, more male-female diversity. But we haven't seen, oh, well, we need more religious diversity in our science advisory advice. We need more political diversity. We need more economic. We need to have some poor people giving advice. We need to have some people who aren't highly educated participating in, I mean, even just saying that, you think, well, that's not how it works. But if people don't see themselves represented in the bodies that are giving advice, we get right to what Maya says. You go right from, well, you're saying something about science, but really you're inching me towards politics and policy. And we feed that because we say things like, well, we're going to follow the science. Right? We're going to listen to the science. I'll give you a very practical example. So in 1990, US Congress passed a law that established the US National Climate Assessment. They made a design flaw. They put the National Climate Assessment in the Executive Office of the White House. It's overseen by political appointees. So during Republican administrations, Republicans put their thumb on the scale and push it towards their policy objectives. During Democratic administrations, they put their thumb on the scale. And then the people on the other side say, I don't see myself in there. And so when we think about diversity in providing science to either to policymakers or to the public, I do think these different dimensions that we don't think of in terms of diversity become more important as we see the data from your report, because if you don't see yourself in there, you're going to have a reaction.
And when it comes to public health policy, it's not merely theoretical, as they say. Any further comment on that question?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of research suggesting that idea has merit, both in work generally on underrepresented groups in STEM and how seeing exemplars and role models who look or think or feel the way that you do can increase groups' participation. But there are some recent studies, for example, showing that religious people who are presented with a role model who happens to be both religious and a prominent scientist who, for example, advocates for the COVID vaccine are more likely to get vaccinated after hearing a powerful message from that individual. And they're more likely to believe that religion and science can coexist. So yeah, I think it's important to consider multiple forms of diversity and bringing the maximum number of groups we can to the table. And to the question that I often get, well, why is it important to increase religious diversity and representation in science? Well, practically speaking, if we don't, given that religious people are still a majority group in the US, we're missing out on the potential expertise of a sizable chunk of the population. And that seems to be a real shame.
So I want to ask a question about vaccines in particular. I don't want to put you on the spot, but in one of the slides that I had, if you look at vaccination status, you do see that it's not across the board that, for example, religious Americans are less likely to be vaccinated. On the contrary, actually, a number of religious groups, if I'm remembering correctly, white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics, are quite likely to be vaccinated, fully vaccinated for COVID-19. White evangelical Protestants are kind of an outlier. And we see a similar dynamic with Black and Hispanic Americans, where, relatively speaking, high levels of vaccination during COVID. I'm curious how we could explain that. What, if you have thoughts about what might be going on there? It's sort of a fairly happy picture compared to a lot of the things that we've been discussing so far today. And I also wonder if it does counter in some way some of the narrative that we've sort of developed here about religious people feeling alienated from science, because at least those data points, when it comes to vaccines, suggest something else, or they might. Anyway, so.
There was a ton of surveying being done before the COVID vaccines were introduced in the late 2020s. There was, as you all will remember, there was a lot of money being put into COVID research, and a lot of people were shifting their research towards COVID so that they could keep their labs going. There were so many surveys of American attitudes. Will you get vaccinated when the COVID vaccine came? That I couldn't even keep up with them. And there was quite a noticeable difference among people of color in America. I did not see data around people who identify as religious, but I can at least speak to racialized groups. And because of that, there was a lot of organizing around that. And they used the tactics that are known to work: culturally sensitive, targeted, things like town hall meetings. They were usually done on Zoom, but targeted discussions to the group, usually offered by members of the group, so that there was that identity affiliation instead of some remote expert, and speaking to the concerns of a group. And it could be culturally informed, language appropriate, let's say for new immigrant groups. And it worked. At least I know Canadian data that showed that those kinds of efforts were actually changing the responses people were having to, will you get the COVID vaccine? The next hurdle was, of course, making it equitably accessible. There were some groups that could not access the COVID vaccine when they got it, but there was good work that was done. I think a lot of it got undermined when the sort of slow, gentle approach was seen as too slow, and we turned more towards mandates, which sort of changed the politics. But there was at least a time where I looked at it and said, this is good work that's being done, and we were actually seeing the benefits of it.
Maya or Roger?
Yeah, so in this conversation, it struck me that one predictor of vaccine hesitancy that just anecdotally I seem to have observed among my acquaintances and friends who are COVID vaccine skeptical is the urban versus rural divide. So I've seen a lot of people who live in more remote areas where people are spread a bit further apart, buying into the narrative that it's my choice and I don't want to do this. And you don't see a lot of that compared to statistics on religious beliefs, political ideology. And I think it's something worth potentially exploring further. And just with respect to that, this is tangentially related, but it does make me think of just interpersonally what we can do to help bridge these divides. I mean, it's hard when we're all living in our different ideological and religious versus secular, urban versus rural bubbles to really engage with people who think differently than we do. But I think in this day and age, it's crucial, and it can help break down our assumptions that, for example, all religious people are anti-science or all religious people are politically conservative. These groups aren't all monoliths, and it's important to appreciate the nuance within these groups and to truly engage and listen to people who are on different sides of the political spectrum. So just as an anecdote, I have a graduate student who does a lot of work on the religion-science relationship in collaboration with me. And at one of the most recent conferences, a researcher from another institution reached out to us wanting to meet to discuss potential ideas for collaboration. It turns out during this meeting, this researcher revealed that they are an evangelical Christian and they're skeptical about some aspects of the theory of evolution and buy into some aspects of intelligent design, and are also politically conservative. And when my student and I walked out of this meeting, he turns to me and he goes, "Can you imagine in the rest of our field how many people would cancel us if they knew that we sat down and had a meeting with this researcher?" And I kind of laughed because he sadly was not wrong. I mean, and keep in mind, we're talking about I'm not discussing the possibility that my student and I all of a sudden are denying evolution and becoming evangelical Christian. We're just sitting down and having a conversation with somebody who embraces those things. And that, in certain parts of our field, is seen as somewhat abominable. And that's really too bad. For the record, this researcher is now a friend of mine, and we wrote a grant together that, fingers crossed, will get funded. So there's good that could come out of these interactions, for sure.
Roger, final word before we open it up for questions.
Yeah, just real quick. I think I learned this from your book. There was a study done in Western Australia where it didn't solve the vaccine hesitancy, but wasn't there an advertising campaign where they had neighbors saying, here's why I vaccinated my kid, and it moved the dial a little bit. But I want to connect this to my original comments at the beginning. There are implications for political power here. We experts lead with science and the deficit model because that's our currency. That's what we have. I can't go in front of a group of evangelicals or Black Americans and say, hey, I'm just like you. Right? What I can say is, oh, I have a PhD and I published all these papers, and so you should do what I say because of that. So the minute that we start talking about, what are the levers that we have to get expert information into households and the public, very quickly we find that, well, maybe it's best not to put scientists out front. So if I go and I say that to my colleagues, they'll say, whoa, 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 whoa. What are you saying? You don't want us out front? We're the ones with the PhDs. So I do think very quickly we get into the politics of science in politics, which makes it doubly complicated to kind of deal with this complexity.
I'd like to open it up for questions. Beginning with Dr. Collins.
Thanks. This is a fascinating discussion for sure. I am Francis Collins. I'm the former director of NIH, and I'm a white evangelical Christian and founded a foundation called BioLogos that aims to provide a safe space for people who are serious Christians who also believe in rigorous science to learn from each other. And I think maybe we'll have had a small role in the fact that perhaps evolution is not quite the same flashpoint for a lot of conservative Christians that it was 10 years ago, although many other factors in there. But I think, from what I'm hearing, I think you're still understating how serious the situation is for white evangelicals. I don't think it's a rare white evangelical who is concerned about statements about the age of the earth being 4.5 billion years old, or the universe being 13.7. A strong fraction of white evangelicals believe the earth is 6,000 years old because that's the literal interpretation of Genesis 1. And that has been very much put into their belief system from Sunday school on down as a critical part of their faith. And if that is being challenged, they are fearful that the whole foundation of their belief, which is a central rock in their life existence, is under threat. So that, and of course that carries all the way back to Darwin and up through the Scopes trial, and then on to creation science in the 1960s and intelligent design, all various ways that continue to create the sense that there's a real problem here and we have to have a defense against that. And that is still down under the surface, even for a lot of people who maybe have started to come to grips with the fact that science is actually not aiming to try to destroy their faith, but there's this fear down there. And when you say, why don't we have more Christians who are in science? Well, a lot of people who grew up in that environment are afraid that science will destroy the foundation of what they believe as having grown up in a Christian environment. So they don't go into science because they're afraid of what it might do, even if they're interested. So it's not just the scientific community doesn't make them feel welcome. It's the Christian community says, you don't want to go there. You're going to lose your faith if you go off to that university, maybe even if you study this stuff, but you certainly don't want to become one of those people. So there's a much bigger issue here than I think maybe has come forward so far in the panel. And I think what is also playing into this, and again, my heart is aching about what's happened with young evangelical Christians and those who believe in young earth, because tens of thousands of people died. I mean, let's be clear about that. Kaiser Family Foundation would say 234,000 Americans are in graveyards today because of the information they got that made them decide not to trust in a vaccine that might have saved their lives. That's not a political calculation. That's just based on the epidemiology. 234,000 people. That's, what, 5 times more than died in all of Vietnam. All because of our culture wars. The culture wars have killed people. And they've killed a lot of white evangelical Christians who are lovely, wonderful, loving people, but who got caught up in this. And what I haven't heard is the role of politics that played in this. Because these are the same folks who were very much brought into the mindset that there is only one political party that you really can legitimately be part of and one leader that you can trust. And that, unfortunately, didn't always give them with information that was particularly scientifically helpful. And the media's in there too. So, you know, the pastors got these folks for an hour on Sunday morning. And then Fox News got them for the rest of the week. And how much chance did they have in trying to sort through what is the information that they might want to know for themselves and their families about how to save a really terrible outcome from COVID? So how about all of that? We haven't really heard the intersection between faith, politics, and media when it came to vaccines.
I'm not going to try to answer. I'm just going to add one data point sort of in support of your commentary and question, which is that if you look at some of the findings we have in the survey, the white evangelical Protestant groups does tend to track the GOP. Like you see that, in other words, insofar as they're an outlier among religious groups, they are in line with a lot of the trends among Republicans. And so that does suggest that the politics is clearly an important part of this. So,
yeah, I have a question. I mean, do evangelicals have greater rates of polio and other, diseases for which there's vaccines? I mean, I think the answer is no. So, I mean, so it clearly shows that in this case it is politics. It's not perceptions of vaccination per se. And, to make the broader point, we don't want to start from here. This is the one where before the pandemic started, if you look at the architecture for a US pandemic response that really was initiated by George Bush after he went to the beach and read a book about the 1918 pandemic, what's missing from there is a science advisory mechanism. And so once it gets into politics, it's too late. And so, my thinking is, I mean, now's the time, and for the next pandemic or whatever, where we should be designing these systems so that it's not going to prevent politicization and it's not going to cure everything, but it's much better to go into a crisis situation prepared for politicization rather than responding to it afterwards, where I think at that point, it's too late.
We also want to pay attention to the communication frame. So of course, the frame is going to highlight certain parts of an argument and make others recede. And if there's one thing I took a lot out of this survey, is that politics shift, people's attitudes shift, and it's largely because of how the stories get constructed. So I already called attention to how evolution is less divided than it used to be. I've told you guys about how attitudes around vaccines have shifted more towards the right, which means people on the left who previously had all these misgivings about usually about big pharma and the weakness of our regulatory systems, came around to it. It wasn't necessarily done in a highly cerebral kind of way, but we created these new associations where you could be, let's say, left-leaning and care about natural living and still get vaccinated. And there actually have been communications efforts to break those culture. I guess they're called cognitive dissonances, where let's say you look at vaccines and say that's something that people like me don't do because I live in Seattle and I'm left-leaning or something like that. And you can create new narratives where something like vaccination could be something that white evangelicals do, or something that left-leaning organic food growers can do. It's not impossible, and we see those shifts because you can actually change those narratives. And What it does is it gives people new opportunities to define themselves vis-a-vis these kinds of choices.
Can I add to that a little bit? So first of all, Dr. Collins, thank you for your comments. You've given me so much to think about. Two things that I'd like to tackle. First, I want to revise my statement that the white evangelical Protestants who are young earth creationists are a minority within that community. I am not, nor was I ever white evangelical Protestant. I was raised Catholic, full disclosure. So I humbly acknowledge that I was probably wrong. But what I will say is that when members of, say, the scientific or academic community think about religious people or even Christians as a whole, I think, I would suspect that they're assuming that these young earth creationist, white evangelical Protestants are a greater proportion of Christians than is actually the case. So I will stand by that. But another point that I wanted to tackle that you made that really resonates with me is that it's not just about religious people feeling not welcome by the scientific community. It's they're feeling this pressure from their own religious community to not lose their faith. And that is not unlike some of the reasons that women might be underrepresented in STEM, according to some research in my field. So not only is there the very real feelings of exclusion and not belonging that they experience in the scientific community, but then they have perhaps their relatives, parents, others in their community having these preconceived ideas of, oh, these are the kinds of careers that women tend to gravitate toward. You know, these are the kinds of careers that are more nurturing and more about helping people, as opposed to science, which is very portrayed as very individualistic and competitive in many circles. So I think even not taking into account the fear of losing faith, which I agree could be a real and palpable fear for evangelical Christians, there are these conceptions of what or who a scientist is that don't resonate with perhaps a lot of the religious community that might also, so there's these two countervailing forces that may keep people out.
Yes.
I had a question for I had a question for Maya, and it's based, what I find interesting, your research on, the anti-vaccine feelings prior to the pandemic. And I generally regarded that as sort of a fringe groups. And my question is, what is the data, the actual data of, any problems or side effects with the vaccines that gave people the impressions that that they're a problem? And I'll just add the context I'm putting that in is the fact that any drug I take today, I get a page of possible side effects and every problems with it. And, the vaccine was pushed very, very quickly by actually a Republican, Donald Trump, to begin with. And I think the concern people might have is transparency of, mRNA vaccines are new. Are there any side effects to those? But in the previous thing before that, what was the evidence that drove people to be anti-vaccination?
Well, there were a number of them. One was concern about adverse events and side effects from vaccines, though I was the main focus of vaccine hesitancy was around pediatric vaccines, some of them that had been around for decades. So we had the long-term data.
Was there data supporting that? Or data?
Certainly, there was data supporting that there are always adverse events associated with vaccines, but they were minimal. They didn't happen often. Most of them were mild, and there was arguments that the benefits of vaccination was much greater than the risk, right? COVID vaccines, of course, we entered the context with, vaccine hesitancy already existed, and suddenly we had new vaccines using an unfamiliar platform. So of course that heightened concerns about adverse events and unknown side effects.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, there's a microphone coming your way.
I'm a nurse, and I have to say I actually have been having some trust problems. And I think for some of us, we see government growing bigger, that they have economic problems, a lot of debt. They kind of became the expert of default on COVID, and you know, media is not seen as fair and balanced. I mean, to use I guess, steal something from Fox. But so I think people may believe that government may temper the information it puts out to deal with societal or economic goals or political goals. So I just wanted to say, you know, that's only a survey of one, but that's me. And, you know, I know other people I've heard speak like that. And also, I know in social media there's a big concern about foreign countries turning Americans against themselves. And I wondered if there's any piece in the using medicine and twisting it around so people don't trust it as a way to, you know, because COVID vaccinations became very political, and they became people fighting over each other, and it was really sad. So thank you. Thank you for your work.
Yes, in the back.
So maybe this comes across as a little bit cynical, but I think like leaning into what Professor Goldenberg was saying about addressing people's concerns where they are, you know, you could have imagined a vaccine advertising strategy that sort of leaned into the polarization. So maybe there was like a Trump vaccine, there's a Biden vaccine, there's even a Jill Stein vaccine. Because, you know, I mean, totally seriously, you go to Whole Foods and you can find eggs that are non-organic, you can find organic eggs, you can find eggs that are pastured and free range, you can find, you know, yogurt that's got probiotics, and you can find non-probiotics. And so, you know, I think sometimes you do need that kind of, you know, go to where people are, be willing to sort of try those kind of zany advertising strategies. I know the FDA has restrictions on what you can advertise with. You have to be truthful, which I guess would make some food advertising comparisons hard, but I think maybe we needed like a probiotic vaccine, right? I mean, the AstraZeneca vaccine had, you know, adenovirus viral vectors. And so you could have maybe said, oh, well, this is, you know, a pretty different vaccine. So maybe some people that are mRNA skeptical, you give them that one instead. So yeah, I don't know, maybe that approach would have done something.
Sure. Yeah.
Can I say something in response to that? As a social psychologist, you wouldn't believe how readily we make, or maybe you would, in-group, out-group distinctions based on very minimal information. And in fact, there's a very interesting new experiment, not my own, sadly, I wish I would have come up with it, but it's by a friend of mine who's still a graduate student at University of California, Merced, Will Meese. And he said he'd watch today, so hi, Will, this is your study. So anyway, he found that people will discriminate, they'll allocate more resources, more money to those that the only thing they know is which vaccine they took. So those who took the same vaccine. So if you're a Pfizer person, you allocate more to the person who took the Pfizer than the Moderna vaccine, and vice versa. So we're even willing to do that. So I think what you're saying has real merit.
I would just as an anecdote, this is, I think, for your colleague. At some point in Canada, they had to create rules about you don't get to choose which vaccine you get because there was a strong public preference for Pfizer. People were showing up to the clinics and saying, no Pfizer, I'm going home, even though the Moderna was virtually identical. And it just had to do with branding. Pfizer was a better known name, so people would have absolutely paid. They were free, it was covered by our healthcare, but they would have paid if you would have given them a little top up for a Pfizer.
Well, actually, the reason that my colleague became interested in this research question was he read some article, I think it might have been in The Atlantic, when the vaccines came out, that one of them, I can't remember if it was Pfizer or Moderna, hopefully Pfizer because that's the one I got, was the attractive people vaccine. And people really jumped on this wagon. And he wondered if there's something to that. So yeah, I don't doubt.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I saw this question over here first.
Hi. Okay. So there have been a lot of different things mentioned about possible politicization of science on the part of maybe the political left maybe in response to the political right, and there's like a chicken and egg kind of question. There's also been some comments about whether the conflicts that we might be interested in have something to do with knowledge that's being produced. So, is religious groups kind of disputing the knowledge or claims that scientists are making? Or is there something more going on with social identity? And it's not a dispute maybe about knowledge, but just about kind of jockeying for power or group status in a landscape of intergroup relations. So I have a few comments on this, and I will say, I just wrote my dissertation about this, so I'm going to try to keep it very simple. But one thing I guess I wanted to bring for discussion and commentary, if you will, is this idea that there has been attention to the notion of science denial, or this psychology of science denial, and some social scientific mobilization to understand why would someone deny that climate change is human caused. And maybe we start with an individual level answer to that question. Or maybe someone's highly dogmatic, and maybe religious people are more dogmatic, and that makes them less likely to want to change their worldview in the face of conflicting information. So we'll put an outcome variable like a factual claim as our locus for understanding and measuring conflict. We say, look, we'll just kind of theorize all the things that detract from belief in climate change as an epistemic claim. But that isn't necessarily going to show us anything with the group of people who believe the facts. How could anyone believe the facts too much? What would we have to theorize about their attitudes and that contribution of those groups or ideologies to any kind of conflict? So I guess one question I have is that in my own research, and I'm curious what you think if you've been in similar spaces, my observation has been that a lot of the statistical modeling choices seem to be informed by this idea that there's a one-sided phenomenon going on here. We just have to see what detracts from belief in the truth. And as a result, we'll say increasing religiosity has a negative relationship with belief in science. Increasing republicanism on a scale from a very strong Democrat to a very strong Republican. But really, it's a multi-sided phenomenon. Fold these scales in half, and you would get estimates for each of these groups, and you'd get a very different story about an intergroup phenomenon that's actually social and not psychological, purely cognitive on its own. And so I guess my question is, how much do we know? How much of what we have discovered is so full of noise because of those assumptions in social science? I mean, this maybe is most relevant to Kimberly, but...
Yeah, so I have something to say about that actually circles back to the very first panel. The gentleman who's the journalist for The Hill said, I forgot how to pronounce your name, but said something about the assumption on one side, I'm right, they're stupid, or they're evil. And there is a theory in social psychology called naive realism that states exactly that if I see the world a certain way, I think other people should fundamentally see the world that way. If they don't, they're either uneducated, misinformed, stupid, immoral people. And I think this is when attitudes and beliefs become steeped in these in-group, out-group distinctions and social identities. That's where we have a real danger of polarization. So I think your comment really resonated with me, and I think you were absolutely right about that.
One thing I would add to that, referring back to our survey data and some pre-existing survey data, is that there is some evidence that polarization, or at least suggestive evidence, that polarization of trust in science is due to negative partisanship, where both sides become an extreme of themselves, so to speak, because of what's going on the other side. And just sort of suggestive evidence of that is that the polarization around trust in science before COVID looked independent of whether overall trust was going up or down. In other words, it didn't seem to be connected to overall levels of trust. And during the pandemic in particular, there was an overall increase in trust in science at one point, and particularly among Democrats. And within the Democratic Party, certain groups have remained very highly trusting. So if you kind of take all those data points and what we know or might know from political science, there may be something about polarization in particular that can help us make sense of that dynamic that you're describing. That it's not simply that one side is becoming distrustful. Actually, at least some groups might be becoming even more trusting because the other side is becoming perceived to be becoming less trusting.
Conversation these groups are having with each other.
Correct. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but please join me in thanking our panelists. And please feel free to stick around. We're having a wine reception just out in the hallway here, so you're welcome to stay and chat. Thank you.